Pavel Eljanov from the Ukraine has been doing very well recently. He's risen to number 13 on the live rating list. But today, in round 7 of Wijk aan Zee, he faced a stern test as he met Magnus Carlsen. Now, Eljanov, with the white pieces, has played the Catalan and wants to play that bishop to g2. Taking on c4 is the most popular move, but Carlsen wanted to keep more tension in the position, and he played bishop b4 check, which is also a popular variation. And the idea is that after bishop d2, instead of exchanging, which makes life quite easy for white, you drop the bishop back to e7. And it means this bishop is slightly poorly placed on d2, because it can be vulnerable to a knight e4 attack. Sometimes it would like to come to the long diagonal, but again, it's not the best square on c3. And, well, let's see how this plays out. So these are very standard moves. And black continues to hold the pawn on d5, which means the bishop on g2 is blocked. So this is the so-called closed variation of the Catalan. And black can play with c6, b6, and perhaps bring the bishop out to b7, sometimes a6. This is a reasonable way to play the position. But instead, Carlsen went for knight e4. So immediately trying to take the initiative. He would very much like to take the bishops, of course. Take the two bishops. So the bishop comes to f4. This is very normal. And now c6. So obviously there's a threat now to take on d5 and take on c7. So c6. Now knight c3. This is quite a well-known position, actually. And I know this looks slightly outrageous for black to play g5, but the idea is that black is probably going to transpose into a kind of Dutch Stonewall position. So, for example, this was played in the Petrosian Botvinnik World Championship match in 1963. There we go. You can't get two better representatives of the Soviet school of chess. So Petrosian played the bishop all the way back to c1, and Botvinnik established this kind of Stonewall Dutch position. And in this case, the g-pawn can be very useful. Perhaps later on supporting f4, perhaps wanting to advance with g4. But instead of that, Eljanov played the bishop back to e3. And Spassky has actually played this position with black, and he also played f5, establishing this kind of Stonewall Dutch position. But instead of this, Carlsen played a very interesting move. He delayed the f-pawn's advance and instead played the knight back to d6. Now, the knight very often ends up on this square in Stonewall Dutch positions. But having delayed f5, this gives black more options, as we're about to see. I know this position makes a very odd impression with black having advanced the g-pawn. I guess because the position is closed at the moment, then black can just about get away with it. But there are also specific ideas involved with g5. For example, if white were to play c5 here, here's the point. The knight drops to f5, hitting the bishop, and if the bishop steps back, then you play g4. The knight moves, and then the black knight takes on d4. Very crafty. So Eljanov has to decide what to do about this pawn on c4. Taking really doesn't look great. That solves a lot of black's problems. This knight is going to move out, and then bishop f5, and this kind of structure is well known to be absolutely fine for black, particularly when the bishop is just hitting the pawn on d5. Needs to be actually on this diagonal, but that's another story. So Eljanov, after a little thought, played b3, and I think that's a good move. Here, Carlsen thought for over 20 minutes, actually. He must have been very tempted to take this pawn, but I think he was right not to take this. In this case, well, let's say white just puts a rook in the middle. So black is a pawn up here. But in this case, I think the pawn on g5 stands out like a sore thumb. It would be great if we could cheat and put the pawn back on g7. White is going to play perhaps bishop c1, e4. I mean, this is a fantastic position for white. So easy for white to play. Very difficult for black. No pawn center. How do you get this bishop out? And ultimately the king is going to be very weak with this advanced g-pawn. Instead, Carlsen played this move knight f5 again. Could have gone for f5, but knight f5 is very interesting. Same idea, you just want to grab this bishop, and the bishop can't retreat because of g4 and the d-pawn hangs. And here, well, what can white do? I mean, possibly rook d1. I mean, you could also defend the bishop with queen d2 or queen d3, but instead Eljanov played a very committal move. After not too much thought, g4, he must have anticipated knight f5, forcing black into taking on e3. Now, black has the two bishops, that's good news. These pawns look pretty messy, and I don't like that pawn on g4 actually. I don't like the pawn on g5, to be honest. I mean, this is such an unusual position. If the position breaks open to black's advantage, then those dart squares can look really weak. But if white gets in e4 and somehow manages to open the middle up, then black's king can be very weak. So it's a very double-edged situation. I like the way Carlsen reacted. Instead of waiting for e4 to happen, he played b5, trying to distract white. So he's offering a pawn. If the pawn's taken, then, I mean, one thing is that it immediately means that the black bishop can develop to b7, and somehow the pressure has been taken off the center. It's not so easy for white to advance with e4. And this extra pawn on the queen side doesn't really have much bearing on the position. I think Eljanov was probably quite right to decline that one. If he closes the position with c5, then again it takes the pressure off black. Perhaps queen c7 and e5. But, well, Eljanov met fire with fire. He played e4. I think, it's a very brave, it's a very bold move. So the players are really matching each other. It's excellent stuff. And here Carlsen could just take off that c-pawn. But I can understand why he didn't, because after e5, somehow white has made sense of that bishop. The bishop's diagonal is opening up. The e4 square is available for the knight. The g-pawn doesn't look too clever now. The f-file is, well, a semi-open f-file. The initiative would be with white. So Carlsen played b4, pushing that knight out of the way. Or at least he thought he was pushing it out of the way. After knight a4, then, well, a couple of moves are possible, but maybe bishop a6, perhaps d takes c4 and then c5. In any case, with the knight on a4, the position certainly isn't as dangerous for black. But after about 15 minutes thought, Eljanov sacrificed a piece. He played e takes d5. So this is a fantastic struggle. Neither player backing down. Carlsen said after the game, I'd certainly seen it coming. I didn't have to accept the piece, but then I thought, let's go for it. And I think the position was unclear after that, but I don't think black should be worse. So what does he mean when he says he doesn't have to accept it? He could have just recaptured here, and then the knight is going to have to move again. And once again, black should be okay here, but okay, it's a complex position. Here probably white would advance. Very unclear. But Carlsen, after some thought, decided to accept the piece. You have to be brave to do this, and you really have to calculate accurately in order to go in for this. Most obvious move here seems to be knight f6. But in this case, white plays c7, and then knight takes g5, opening up the bishop's diagonal and also opening up the f-file. So rook takes f6 and queen h7 mate threatened, as well as the rook in the corner. Typical Catalan tactic. So Carlsen played knight b8, which, I mean, looks so grovelly, looks dreadful, so passive. In fact, he's worked out that he's probably okay here. If, well, one would like to play knight e5, but that doesn't work. Queen takes d4, check. So in order to protect that pawn, white has to play queen e4. The reason Carlsen played knight b8 was that he realised he could force. He has a forcing variation here to actually get the queens off. He can play f5. White really has to take this. If the queen moves away, then the knight will take on c6. So Eljanov has to exchange queens. This is why Carlsen took the piece. He realised he could reach an ending. Now it's an ending which is highly unclear. You can see that white has this pack of pawns in the middle, but Carlsen can blockade them. Rook ac1, and now knight c7 blockading, and knight e5, but still incredibly dangerous if white can get these pawns rolling. It reminds me of some of Kramnik's games actually from the Catalan. But Carlsen's worked out that he's just about okay here. He played f4 here. Knight b5 looks like a very attractive move actually. Hitting the d pawn, and if e3, then bishop a3. This gives the knight some security. So, you know, black is kind of blockading these pawns. It's an interesting option. Instead, Carlsen played f4, also very tempting. Perhaps he wants to bring the bishop out here. It certainly stops white, but it's not so easy for white to advance the e-pawn. Probably white should take on c3 now, and this is just highly unclear. Maybe king g7, maybe knight b5. These are possible options. Very unclear position. Eljanov played knight c4, and from this moment on, Carlsen goes into overdrive. Rook takes c3, and now knight takes d5. Well, Eljanov had planned this. He realised he could win back material in this position because the diagonal opens up. But actually, this kind of makes life easier for Carlsen as well, because once these pawns disappear, then I think it's much easier for black to play than white actually, because these two bishops are potentially so strong. So what's the pawn situation? Well, white has a rook and a pawn against two bishops. Let's see. But those bishops on an open board, even, or perhaps because there are so few pawns on the board, those bishops so incredibly powerful. Important thing is not to let white get a hit at the king. So that bishop covers g2, so rook g2, not possible. Very difficult position for Eljanov to play. He could take on f4, but the rook comes in. You know, all black needs to do is get a check to the king, and with those bishops, it's all over. He played h4, but things just went from bad to worse now. And now the knight comes into play. That knight that looks so bad in the corner, but in fact, coming back and performing a very useful task. If these pawns are captured, well, let's have a look. Knight c4, you take here. Well, that pawn can be supported by the bishops very easily. It's completely winning for black. In the game, knight e5 was played. F takes e3. Rook d4. Whoops, I beg your pardon. Rook takes d4. And there's simply no defence. this bishop performs a very vital role of protecting the king. And here, now the knight comes in. What a clump of pieces in the middle of the board. And white has absolutely no attack against the king. Here, Eljanov resigned. If knight check, then the king just strides up the board to g6. Soon there's going to be a check on this diagonal. The pawn is too powerful. It's a horrible position. Carlsen played so impressively there. I mean, both players did actually. They both played so boldly, but Carlsen was the one who kept his nerve and found exactly the right move. So Carlsen has won 3 games in a row. He's now in the lead with 5 points. Caruana also won today. Big game. He defeated Ding Liren. So Caruana and Carlsen have 5. Wesley So, Anish Giri, Ding Liren all on 4 points. But Carlsen was definitely the star of today. Tomorrow, Karyakin plays Carlsen. Not an easy one. Carlsen has often had difficult games against Karyakin in the past. And Navarra plays Caruana. Thanks for watching.